Thank you very much, Congresswoman Chu, for speaking with Voice of America. I would like to start off with the issues of Asian Americans' participation in the United States politics. As the first Chinese American woman elected to the United States Congress, what are your thoughts on the current state of Chinese Americans getting involved in U.S. politics? Do you see an upward trend of more Chinese Americans participating in local and national elections?
Well, I think that there is tremendous power and potential in the Chinese American vote. And let me tell you that Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic segment of the U.S. electorate. And Chinese Americans are the largest Asian Pacific Islander subgroup in the nation. So the Chinese American community continues to grow, and we see the Chinese American community becoming more involved in U.S. politics and making their voices heard. Now, we've seen progress in Congress. There was a time when we were completely invisible in Congress, and as a result, there have been terrible policies in the past, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Why would such a discriminatory law be passed against Chinese Americans? Well, there was nobody in Congress. We had no voice. But today, we have 20 Asian American Pacific Islanders that have been elected to Congress. Of those, we have 4 that are Chinese American. There's Grace Meng, Ted Lieu, myself, and in the Senate, there's Tammy Duckworth. Mm-hmm. So we are seeing more and more Chinese Americans running for office. This year, we had Andrew Yang, who ran for president, and actually did quite well. He really electrified the nation with his presidential bid, his bold ideas, and of course he had a huge following, the Yang Gang, and they were multi-ethnic. I mean, it was really interesting being around them because they were all kinds of people, but somehow they gravitated to the kind of words and vision that he had.
Mm-hmm. You're also the chairwoman of CAPAC, Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. In your view, what's the biggest challenge for Asian Americans to run for a political election in the U.S.?
One problem is not having the infrastructure, and we didn't have the kind of big groups that would help us get elected at the beginning. We are starting to develop that, so it is something that is very much needed, and we are trying to provide that. And in fact, I must tell you that CAPAC, the organization I chair, the Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus, has a political arm, and it tries to do exactly that. That is, provide the political help, the fundraising, the kind of political know-how that can get a person of Chinese American descent and Asian American descent elected to office. Mm-hmm. So we have very good prospects for this coming election in November. I think that our Asian American numbers are going to grow. Mm-hmm. But I do have to say there's something that is a problem for Chinese Americans, and that is stereotyping. We have a stereotype in the United States, which is the perpetual foreigner stereotype. And that is, no matter how long you've been here, or maybe you're someone like me who was actually born here, stereotype is that you belong to somewhere else. You belong to China.
Next subject, I would like to talk about COVID-19 pandemic. It's probably one of the most important issues that shapes the discussion of the upcoming elections and how it changed the way we live. Obviously, many are concerned about the role WHO plays in this pandemic this time. What's the most urgent task, in your opinion, that the U.S. should take or should work with other countries to solve the crisis caused by this pandemic?
Well, we have to restore our partnerships with people around the world. He wants to withdraw from the WHO. We know that really the only way that we can defeat this virus is through international cooperation. And we saw this with SARS. We saw that it took doctors from all across the globe to share information about the cases of who was at risk, how to treat it, and how to contain it. And of course, we can't contain it unless we work cooperatively around the world. So that's what I think is missing right now because his president doesn't want to cooperate with others. And of course, that cooperation is absolutely necessary once a vaccine is developed. First of all, there's going to be a huge task to get everybody here in the United States to be able to take that vaccine. But clearly, we need to have that vaccine distributed around the world if we're going to contain this virus.
Mm-hmm. It's always critical for our audience to also understand the U.S. Congress views and policies toward China. Some of your colleagues from both parties believe that China is the biggest threat to the national interest of the United States, and it's a generational challenge. Do you agree with this assessment?
I think that there are numerous challenges out there, and right now, of course, President Trump is mainly pointing the finger at China so that he can divert attention away from Russia. I'm thinking a lot about our elections right now, and Russia actually provides the greatest threat. They are actively interfering with our elections. We saw that they actively interfered in 2016. But every time there is evidence of this kind of interference and active aggression against us, President Trump turns the attention to China as a threat. Now, of course, I know that we have issues with China on topics like trade, on other issues pertaining to human rights, and so we need to deal with those issues. But for Trump and his followers, they are using the China threat at every single opportunity. And I believe that it really is because they don't want to have any blame on Russia. They want to basically change the subject.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that there are several issues that we need to deal with China. However, we don't hear as much discussion on China from Democratic Party as Republican Party. Do you see a sense of urgency or consensus across the party lines when it comes to how to tackle the challenge posed by Beijing?
I think you're wrong in saying that there's not as much discussion on China from the Democratic Party. Actually, it's the Democratic Party, our Democratic caucus, that put a bill on the floor just this last week to protest what was happening with the Uyghurs.
Right.
And so that was this past week to condemn the imprisonment of the Uyghurs as wrong, and also to say that we do not accept any products that are made through the forced labor of Uyghurs. Mm-hmm. And we also had several resolutions passed on protecting Hong Kong's autonomy and freedom. And so we have done that. We've blocked the import of goods from Xinjiang province, and we also have sanctions for those who would try to violate that. So on human rights, I would have to say that the Democratic Party and caucus have been very strong on those issues.
You mentioned the human rights issues in China. That's probably one of the most issues that both parties agreed to work on together. But among all of the threats from China, from human rights violations, censorship, to military competition, or supply chain reliance on China, among all of these challenges, which ones are the most alarming to you?
Well, I do think that the human rights issues are very, very alarming. And we're talking about 1 million Uyghurs that are being put into these camps. I actually also visited the Dalai Lama in India and was able to hear from numerous Tibetans on what happened to them. And the human rights also has to do with all the people that are being put under surveillance in China, and then if they say something that is not pleasing to the Chinese government, then they are questioned or even put in prison, such as that first doctor who reported on the threat of coronavirus. He was taken in, and yet all he was trying to do was to warn the Chinese people in the world about the threat of coronavirus. So that is very, very troubling, and that concerns me greatly.
And then my last question is a broader picture of U.S.-China relations. Back in July, Secretary Pompeo called Chinese people to work with the U.S. to transform or to alter Chinese Communist Party's behaviors. What's your take on that call? And how can the U.S. reach out to or work with the Chinese people and the international community to balance China's rise of influence? We know there are a lot of Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants in your district.
Oh, yes. Well, I think it's important for us to communicate with the Chinese people because the people of China is different from the government of China. And I think the people of China clearly want the freedom to speak, the freedom to move around, the freedom to be able to have an autonomous life. I think that they would want people to be treated equally and fairly. And so we need to encourage those who have those feelings, and we need to be able to support them. That's why it was important for us to pass these bills and resolutions on the mistreatment of the Uyghurs and also to support the Hong Kong autonomy movement.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Chu, for speaking with Voice of America. Appreciate your time and then participation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.